Chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. If you don't have a Bible, there are some available there on the cart. You don't have to come too many Sundays to get the feel that I like to open the scriptures and turn to a lot of different places. So, Exodus chapter 2. Verse 1 through 22 here, which Christopher just read for us. So last week we entered into Exodus chapter 1, and we did it looking at Exodus 1 with this lens that God is the only person. He's the only person who has both the authority and power to accomplish what he wills. Pharaoh doesn't. Neither does any other human being. So today, as we enter into this chapter here, chapter 2, in these first 22 verses, I'm continuing with that lens. And we're going to see again that Pharaoh doesn't have that power and authority, the power to carry out. And he's in opposition to God's purposes. But we're also going to be introduced to Moses. And Moses is a man who's set apart from God. And he is, unlike Pharaoh, in the big scheme of things, working with God's ultimate purposes. And yet, Moses takes matters into his own hands. And that doesn't go so well for him, as he winds up killing a man. But God's purposes are not thwarted. Ultimately, God is indeed the only person who has the power to release us from the bondage of sin and slavery. He's the only person who has the ability, has the authority, has the power to release his people Israel out of the bondage and slavery they're in Exodus, in Egypt. And what it will take is a man like Moses, but greater than Moses, a man named Jesus, who doesn't take matters into his own hands, but who acts in perfect accordance with God's will, no matter the cost, to free us and redeem us from bondage. So Exodus chapter 2. Again, there is so much in here, and I want to draw a few things out. And the first thing I want to do is I want to continue to frame up Exodus and Moses' story in the overall story of God and the unfolding of God's purposes that fall into that creation, fall, redemption, restoration story that we're a part of. And so let's look at a couple different things here. First is this connection to creation. Very specifically, Exodus chapter 2 starts as a man from the house of Levi went and took as wife a Levite woman, and the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw, in the ESV it says here, that he was a fine child, and she hid him 3 months. Anyone have a different version there than the ESV? What do you got, Christopher? And what does it say?
Beautiful.
He was a beautiful child.
Delightful.
What's that?
Delightful.
Okay, so we got beautiful, we got delightful, we got fine. Those are all saying similar things, right? I wish English translators sometimes would the word here in Hebrew is simply good. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw he was good. I want you to think creation story. Where are things declared to be good in the creation story? Genesis chapter 1. God in the creation story 7 times. This is the same word that is used in Genesis chapter 1 7 times. God saw, and he said it was good. And he created this, and it was good. And it was good. He saw, and it was good. And he creates everything, and he says it was very good. It is no coincidence that the word here used to describe Moses in Exodus is the same word. There is this intentional connection to creation, to Genesis. Moses' mother sees Moses, and he saw that he was good. Let's look at this next word here. This next verse. It says this: When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes. Anyone have in your version of the Bible a different word than basket? No, same. All right. So this word here in Hebrew for basket, which is used twice, is really only found in one other place, in Genesis. Genesis chapter 6, where there's a man named Noah, and he was called to build a... It's the same word.
Really?
Yes. Same Hebrew word. Moses is placed into an ark. What does the ark do for Noah and his family? Saves him from the waters. Saves him from the flood. They're not drowned. What is Pharaoh commanding happen to the Hebrew sons? What's it say at the end of chapter 1 here? Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, verse 22, every son that is born to a Hebrew, you shall what? You shall cast him into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. The Nile is where the Hebrew sons were to be drowned. Humanity, when God cleanses the earth, is drowned in the flood. Except for Noah and his family, who's put in an ark and saved and delivered through this ark, through the waters. Direct connection here, you guys. It's an intentional connection to the story of God. Let's go down to the end of the chapter. At the end of chapter 22 here, not the last, very end verses, but verse 21 says, Moses was content to dwell with him, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah, and she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. Who called themselves sojourners in the land from the book of Genesis? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all called themselves sojourners. The Hebrew word ger, G-E-R. What does Moses say of himself here? And he calls his son Gershom. He says, I've been a sojourner. Oh, let's look up here just a little bit to verse 16. What's it say here? Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled up their trough to water their father's flock. Who shows up there? Moses. Does one of those daughters become his wife?
Yes.
How does ultimately Isaac receive his wife? When Abraham's servant, what? Went and looked to the land, and where does he show up? He goes to and sits by a well, and who comes to water? Rebecca. How does Jacob receive his wife? He goes and sits by a well, and Rachel comes to water the flocks. How does Moses receive his wife? He goes to a well where women come to water their flocks. Do you guys see what's going on? The Word of God really doesn't ever cease to amaze me. And the way that it is put together in the finest details. Moses is called good. Creation is called, there's this direct connection to the creation story. Because what God intends to do is to create a place and create a people in which he can dwell, and love can happen in relationship between God and humanity and each other. Those are his purposes. The fall disrupts that. But God is not going to stop that from him. Not going to allow that to stop him from continuing to unfold those purposes. He could have done everything away. And so he continues to walk this out. And what does he do? He calls Noah. Cleanses the earth, and he sets Noah forth on the land. Fresh. Go forth and multiply. We saw that connection a couple of weeks ago. Moses is connected to Noah. He's delivered an ark through the Nile River. And then he calls Abram, in Genesis chapter 12. And through Abram begins to unfold the covenant promises with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, very specifically. The unfolding, so ultimately the unfolding purposes of God to redeem and rescue his people through Jesus is going to come through. And Moses, who's going to be used by God to redeem and rescue his people from slavery in Egypt, is connected intentionally here in this one chapter. It's very specifically with creation, with Noah, and with the patriarchs. And the pages are just dripping with it. And sometimes we just don't see it in our Hebrew Bibles, or in our English Bibles, and that's okay. That's why we're entering into it here this morning. But I want you guys to see those connections. Here's something else. We talked a lot about sons and daughters last week, and we're going to see it here again. There's a structure in this passage where the opening and the closing of these passages from two. Of course, this wasn't written in chapters and verses, but there's sections, right? And so the way that chapter 2 opens and the way it closes mirrors each other. So what I want you to see is this. At the opening, what do we have? We have a marriage in verse 1, right? A man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. We have a marriage. What comes next? Children. I think there's an old, yeah. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby to baby carriage. All right, so that is the pattern that's established in Exodus chapter 2 here. We have a marriage, then we have a birth, which is Moses. And then, what happens after this? We have the rescue and deliverance of a son by daughters. We have females, we have women and girls used by God to rescue a vulnerable son. Moses' mother, Moses' sister, and Pharaoh's daughter. What happens at the end of this passage? Let's go back down here again. Starting in verse 16, it says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came and drew water and filled their troughs to water their father's flock. We just looked at them. And then shepherds came up and drove them away. But Moses stood up and what? Saved them and watered their flock." Hold that thought. What happens following this? Verse 21. "And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses to his daughter Zipporah," a marriage. So we have a rescue, a marriage, and what follows marriage? We set the pattern a minute ago. A baby. And how does this passage end? She gave birth to a son. So at the beginning of this chapter 2, the structure is you have a marriage, a birth, and a rescue. At the end of the passage, you have a rescue, a marriage, and a birth. At the beginning of the passage, though, it is daughters who are used to rescue a son. At the end of the passage, it's a son who's used to rescue daughters. And we cannot overlook this fact. Again, what I'm trying to tease out here a little bit is that God's purposes will be accomplished because only he has both the authority and the power to carry them out. What did Pharaoh want to do? He wanted to destroy the sons of Israel, so those sons couldn't grow up to be part of an army which would overthrow them. That's why at the end of this chapter he says, hey, cast all the sons into the Nile River. Who rescues Moses out of the Nile River, out of the ark that he's been put into? Pharaoh's own daughter. What does Pharaoh command? He commanded his own people to kill the baby sons. Now, I'm certain that not everyone carried out his command. I'm certain many people look the other way because I know what human nature's like. But Pharaoh's own daughter in his own household becomes the means of rescue and salvation, right? For Moses. boy who should be destroyed is going to become the one who is the means of rescuing people under the slavery of this man, and is his own daughter, his own household, is the one who brings this about. And the Nile River, in which he should be destroyed, is the means by which he is saved. And he is very vulnerable. He's a baby boy. He's very vulnerable. And it's very reason here in his infancy that women are involved in saving, because throughout history, obviously, women are involved in childbirth and child rearing, especially in infancy, when you have nursing going on and what's going on here. And so they step up, these brave, faithful women, and rescue this boy. But what happens when boys and girls, sons and daughters, grow up? It is since the fall, since the curse, women have been more vulnerable, and they are. And so we find the tables turned here in verse 16. Again, you have the priest of Midian. He's got 7 daughters. And you have a picture of them, and they're watching his flocks, right? And so they've got to come to the well to water their flocks. But who comes? These other shepherds, we don't know who are. They're not named. And they drive them away. They drive them away. But it says here then, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. Men who are oppressing these women, but then a man who comes in and saves them because they're vulnerable in that place. And it really just stood out to me, you guys. The reality is that men and women need each other. It's rooted back in creation. God created humanity in his image. I keep going back to this for the last 3 weeks here. He creates man in his image, male and female, he creates them. Obviously, this is a whole nother sermon, and I'm going to say this in about 2 minutes, or else I'll get sidetracked and open a can of worms that I don't want to open. But there is a lot of conversation in our society. You guys, we're all in it. We know there's conversation in our culture about what it means to be human. There's conversation in our culture about what it means to be male and female. And what God tells us is that he created man and woman. He created male and female, and we are not complete. What is the first time God says something is not good in Genesis 1 and 2 is when he looks at Adam and says, it's not good for man to be alone. There is something about male and female in which we're not complete without each other. And yes, that can happen in marriage, obviously, but not for every person necessarily. But in the context of the community of God, we are dependent upon each other. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that we are not independent, man and woman. So there's this very unique thing, and it's a challenging subject, and yet at the same time, God has created us. He's created us with bodies. He's embodied us as male and female, and it's his gift to us to live that out. And we need to be dependent upon each other and blessing each other and looking out for each other in the context of the family, the human family and the family of God. And we see a picture of this here in this passage where vulnerable males are rescued by females, and then vulnerable females are rescued by a male. It's part of the work of God. All right, now let me get to the main point of my sermon. Moses in the middle of the chapter. All right, you guys, I'm not going to reread the story. You get some of it here. But Moses, by faith and with sincerity, really does see himself as set apart by God to help deliver his people. And by faith and with sincerity, he acts on that. But it doesn't turn out so well for him. He winds up killing a man. You guys know a little bit of the story. Let's look at 2 quick passages because I think it helps illuminate here. So in Acts chapter 7, this is all we have in the story here is what we've already looked at in Exodus. But in Acts chapter 7, Stephen, who's one of the first deacons of the church, is going to become the first martyr of the church. And before he is put to death, he tells Israel's story, or he tells God's redemptive story of his people. And in verse 20, starting in verse 20, he specifically talks about Moses. So we get a little biblical interpretation of our passage here. And in verse 20 it says, "At that time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight." He was good, remember? "And he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house, and when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son." It's a beautiful thing. "And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds." That's all we have. So Moses was brought up in Pharaoh's house. He was educated in Pharaoh's house. He was given a position in Pharaoh's house. He was mighty and powerful in the royal house of Pharaoh. Verse 23. "But when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian." This is our passage. Verse 25 is key. "He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. And on the following day he appeared to them as they were quarreling and tried to reconcile them, saying, 'Men, you are brothers. Why do you wrong each other?' But the man who was wronging his neighbor thrust him aside, saying, 'Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?' At this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. And then when 40 years had passed, and we'll get there in the next couple of weeks. But there's a couple interesting things in here. Moses really did believe he was acting. Here's a couple things. Moses was moved, just as he rescues the daughters of Midian who are being oppressed. He's moved by the slavery and the misery of his own people. And he chooses to leave his position and his place and his power in the royal household to come to try to help his people. And that's a good thing at that level. But it doesn't work out, because even so, his timing is not aligned with the timing of God. All right, Hebrews, just last passage here. I just bring one more illumination on this, because I think it's really important to help understand what's going on in Exodus. In Hebrews chapter 11, which is called the chapter of faith. We had the chapter of love, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. What do we have here? Hebrews 11 is called the chapter of faith. Verse 23. It says, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents." That's very cool. His parents, yes, by faith. They trusted in God. They hid him because they saw that the child was beautiful. Again, that phrase is used again. He was beautiful. He was good. Connection with creation. And they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. I'm not going to comment all on this, but I am going to say here, the decision for him to leave behind his position and place in the palace at 40 years old and move into with his people, the Hebrews, and try to use whatever position, power, authority that he had, he did it by faith. And again, I don't want to over-speculate here. We don't know if Moses had received some revelation by God that this is what he was set apart for. I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities to try to chase down with that. But in his mind, he thought by doing this, the Hebrews would see that God was using him to deliver it. That's what we get from Acts. And it says in the Hebrews that he did this by faith. He was trusting God. He was trusting God to do so. And it still didn't work out in that moment. He killed a man. And what happens after this? He flees. And where does he wind up? Outside of Egypt. And he lives for 40 years in Midian. Again, I don't want to over-speculate. It's just trying to draw some things from human nature. It says he was content to live in Midian. One moment, he believes he's the savior of his people. He's willing to put his life on the line. And then he's willing to stay for 40 years in the middle of nowhere, apart from his people. Discouragement, depression, disillusionment, I have no idea. All those things could be involved with that. But he goes for 40 years. But the act itself was an act of sincerity and an act of faith. And the reality is this, is that God's purposes and his timing are not always ours. And even when we have the sense that we are in the will of God, even when we have this sincere desire and motives, they still may not be fully aligned, because we live by faith and not by sight. We don't see clearly. But it didn't disrupt God's purposes and timing. What is God's overall purpose and timing? To rescue and redeem his people. And he did purpose to use Moses to be the means to do that. Just not in the way that Moses carried it out. He acted independently. He acted alone. Maybe it was an impulsive sort of thing at the moment in time. I get that. I'm a man of action. And it's hard for me to wait on God. It's been a lifelong journey. Was I born this way? Was I, nurtured this way? Yes. Both. I think I was born this way, and I think I was nurtured this way. And it's kind of how it came out. I was having a conversation with a fellow pastor a few years ago, and he was saying, hey, this person has a bias towards action. I'm like, yeah, so do I. He's like, no, Shane, you don't have a bias towards action. You are action. You just do. And he wasn't saying that negatively. It was just an observation point. So I get some of what Moses is going on, and I've done a lot where I felt like I was acting by faith, tried to bring my motives before God, sincerity, all that kind of stuff. But it still doesn't guarantee. But that doesn't mean God casts us off. He didn't cast Moses off. He didn't cast Moses off. Even then, it was by faith. It was in sincerity. He was acting out of a motive to care for his people and do what he could to rescue his people. But here's the reality. Only God has the power. Only God has the ability to rescue his people out of slavery. And God's purposes for the people of Israel was to be through his right arm, not Moses's. Yes, Moses is an instrument, but God wanted to be really clear so that his people could give glory to nobody else, no other person, that they would see that it was Yahweh alone who had the power and authority and the love and care for his people to rescue them. He alone. They couldn't rescue themselves out of redemption. Moses doesn't have the ability to rescue them out of slavery either. Only Yahweh. And that's a story that's going to unfold, right? Through the Passover, through the crossing of the Red Sea. God's power alone is able to do that. We cannot rescue ourselves. We are like the people of Israel. We are in bondage ever since after it was good. Oh, and then Adam and Eve saw some fruit on a tree, and we've been in rebellion. And the consequences of that rebellion is bondage to sin and death, and we can't rescue ourselves out of it. Just like the people of Israel could not rescue themselves out. And Moses, as good as he was, as powerful as he was, who had good motives, even in moving into his action, was not able. He took matters into his own hands. But Jesus isn't like Moses. He is like Moses, but he's greater than Moses. Where it says Moses was good, Jesus is truly the good. Where Moses was set apart to be used by God to rescue and redeem his people, he took matters into his own hands. Jesus was set apart and sent to rescue and redeem us. But he did not take matters into his own hands. What did we hear from the gospel just a few minutes ago? Jesus said, hey, look, we're going to Jerusalem. And the Son of Man is going to suffer and die, be spit upon, flogged. Flogging is just horrible. Die on a cross and will rise. Jesus lived in perfect accordance with the Father's will. He knew the purposes of God. He lived in accordance with the purposes of God. He never acted independently from the purposes of his Father, and he carried it out. He laid down his life. He didn't take one. Moses took matters in his hands, and he took another person's life. Jesus laid down his life. And he became the means through that of our rescue and our redemption. And we heard from the chapter of faith. By faith, by faith, by faith, Moses did these things. We receive that rescue and redemption only through faith. God says, here's my son. Jesus said, I went to the cross. Jesus, how hard was it? We know that not too long after he speaks these words, he's going to be in a garden praying. Did he act in accordance with Jesus, with his Father's will? Yes. What was his Father's will? That he suffer and die. How hard was that for Jesus? He cried out to Jesus, suffering and sweating in blood. If there's some other way, Father, if there's some other way, but not my will, but yours be done. And he went to the cross for us. And we, by faith, receive that. We are rescued and redeemed. We're not going to live out the perfect will of the Father, but this is why we have to. By faith, discerning through the Word, discerning with each other. If you're like me and you have a bias towards action, or you're a man or woman of action, that's a harder road. Some of you are the opposite way, and maybe sometimes need to move towards action sometimes. But ultimately, we need each other. We're bringing around some fish with this. We need each other. We cannot do this alone. We have to encourage each other to love and good deeds, pointing each other to Jesus, encourage each other in the Word and in prayer, so that we live our lives in accordance with the will of the Father to the best that we can understand, recognizing that He alone is the one who has the power to rescue and redeem.